I'd like to welcome James Welling and Walter Ben Michaels for the afternoon session.
Thank you, Arthur. It's great to be here with some familiar faces from Los Angeles and New York, I see. And it's also great to, sorry, I want to start at a different spot. It's also great to follow Charlotte Cotton because Charlotte, with Words Without Pictures, started a really interesting dialogue in photography that Marvin Heiferman was telling me that, reminding me that there are a number of conversations that have been going on about questions around photography. The stuff that's been going on at MoMA for the last couple of years. I was part of a conference at UCLA called Around Photography, and Words Without Pictures, obviously. So it's great to be part of this conversation that Arthur's organized, and I'd like to thank the New School. I thought I'd show some slides looking at, I guess, how I use Photoshop. When Charlotte was talking about, when photography changed for me in 1997 when I first got a copy of Photoshop at whatever version it was, 4.0. Up until that point, I'd never really worked in color, and I had a kind of, I want to call it clunky, but I had a kind of awkward and self-conscious relationship to pictures made with analog materials. Even though I work today mostly digitally, I still go back and forth, as many of you do. So I wanted to show you a couple of projects that use Photoshop. Charlotte was also talking a lot about the future of photography. But one of the great things for me about the medium of photography is it's also a medium of the past. Obviously, it's always about things that have been. So as we look at the future of photography, we also look backwards. And finally, that the great set of tools in Photoshop, as many of you know, a lot of these come from other disciplines, mostly the printing industry. So it's as Photoshop is a kind of mixture of all of these tools, but they're also based on a lot of old-fashioned photo practices. The first group of pictures I'll show you three groups of photographs. These are from a series of images that I made at the Philip Johnson Glass House. And I was invited to photograph there by Jody Kwan at New York Magazine. And she challenged me to do something different. The Glass House is one of the most photographed structures in America. So I was able to take some techniques that I was using in another body of work, namely using colored filters as a way of working with a glass house. One of the things that fascinates me and has been fascinating since I started working with Photoshop is the use of channels in Photoshop. As everyone knows, and it doesn't really need to be repeated, but our eyes use red, green, and blue channels. Physiologically, we're taking parts of the spectrum and breaking them up into RGB channels using sensors in our eyes. And this is the basis for all photographic processes, or all practical photographic processes, and all reproductive processes. So I've been working with red, green, and blue channels, red, green, and blue filters, and started to work with the filters themselves. In photographing at the Glass House, I used the act of putting filters in front of the lens, putting pieces of glass. This is basically a clear piece of glass at the bottom of the frame that's reflecting what's behind me as a way of kind of doubling or intensifying the experience of being there. And so for me, this project was about being at the Glass House 2x, twice, both being there literally, but also adding things to it, using the structure of the Glass House as an armature to hang these sort of experiments that I was working on. And even though a lot of these pictures are done on the spot, I'm not, using a lot of Photoshop interventions. They're all printed digitally. Obviously, the inverted photographs are worked on in Photoshop. When Arthur suggested the title of our talk be Photography and Art, I changed it to Architecture, Site, and Photography, because I was working with this idea of the site. Is the site the work of art, or is it the photograph of the site? But in the interest of time, I've kind of compressed the talk to just really looking at these pictures I've made of architecture. This project, this is one of the Photoshop interventions where I have a black and white photograph in the bottom and a color photograph in the top. The second group of photographs I'd like to show are pictures that I made at the 1934 Pierre Chareau designed Maison de Verre. And these are all images that were made like the glass house pictures with a digital camera, but I worked on them in Photoshop. And I've kind of intensified the colors in some cases and exaggerated, used different tools, hue and saturation, posterization, gradient mapping, to change the color of this extremely interesting kind of machine for living that was a gynecologist's office. It's also the site of Walter Benjamin's, he was intending to give his talk called Author as Producer at the Maison de Verre, because the people who owned it were very interested in intellectual ideas of the time. But Benjamin came down with the flu and did not give Author as Producer here. The Maison de Verre is really prison-like. It's lots of black tile and black painted doors. So I guess I'm looking at, in the glass house, I'm looking at interventions that I make while I'm taking the picture at the moment of the exposure, and these pictures are all done in post. This is the doctor's office. In intensifying the colors, this particular image is like a kind of summer sunrise almost, and when it's 150 degrees outside. I mean, these pictures are all in person. They're kind of torqued and are very strange-looking images. Both of these I present as inkjet prints. These are on matte paper, and the others are on glossy paper. So in a way, what remains of the Maison de Verre is the black and white armature, the structure of the photograph, where in these two pictures, the previous one, the columns are beige, and this one, the columns are red. So I'm able to, using hue and saturation, make big alterations to the image, but in some way the structure, the architecture of the house, the black and white image, stays constant. And the last group of pictures that I'm going to show you are a series of photographs I made in 2005 with the program Maya, which is a 3D program and generally used for animation. And the title of this project is called War, and they were made in response to seeing a lot of pictures coming back from Iraq where there were a lot of car bombings. And so what I did was I took a plastic tile that was about 3 inches square by about 1 inch high, and measured it, traced it, entered it into Maya, working with an assistant who knew the program, because I don't know the program, but I directed him. And we created a grid of 64 of these plastic 3-inch square tiles by 1 inch deep or high. I laid them out on a space and then fractured them using different tools to create different fractures. Then we lit the exploded landscape, and I flew around with a mouse and made photographs. And these are printed out as 24 by 36 inch inkjet prints. One of the things about Maya is that it's textureless. So these pictures have an absolutely sickening kind of smoothness to them. This is kind of in the middle of the structure, all of the destruction. And there you can see the grid of tiles. This is the last slide, so let me turn it over to Walter.
So I'm really glad to be here today. Actually, do you have the little graph? We have actually Welling's most recent work, screenshot by James Welling. Yeah. It's just sort of background, come later. Jim and I have actually been having conversations for, like 25 years. This one will be different in two ways. It's in public. And the second one is the structure of our conversations has sort of been, I'm a literary critic and literary theorist. I sort of do 90% of the talking. Jim sort of, stands there and looks beautiful. But it hasn't been a huge problem for him because what I mainly talk about is him and his work. So today is going to be a little bit different, partly because it is in public, but partly also because I'm not going to really talk that much about Jim. I'm going to try and keep quiet. I've only got 10 minutes, not talk too much and not talk too much about Jim. Although I do well say that for my thinking about photography, but more than that, about art in general, has been deeply informed by just looking at things like the kind of pictures you just saw for the last 10 minutes. So I would never have written the things I've written, for better or for worse, if I hadn't had a kind of extended relation to those pictures. One of the advantages of doing 10 minutes is that you can't possibly give the reasons for the things you believe. You can just sort of say them. It's kind of freeing in a certain way. You don't have to have an argument. So I'm just going to say a couple of things. What I wanted to talk about was first today, the first title, but we went with Jim's, which was sort of photography as art. But also, especially in the wake of the discussions this morning, which I thought were fascinating, from which I profited greatly, talk about photography as art and at the same time talk about photography as politics, because I actually think in the last 20 years, the only way you can talk about photography and politics is by talking about photography as art. That's where I don't really have to give the reasons, but I'll give us a suggestion of what the reasons are, and that is I think that one thing to say is that the reason that photography has been beyond the talents of individual photographers so central to the history of art in the last, let's say, 20 or 25 years is because it's in photography that the question of form and what form might be has been raised most powerfully and answered in different ways. And a kind of longer account of this would require a sort of history of the critique of form, the critique of representation that came out of post-structuralism, the sort of development of that in the 70s and 80s, and its ongoing forms now. If you look on the website that Arthur's produced so brilliantly and read Jacques Rancière's piece, a piece that I completely disagree with, you will see, though, how the question of form is at work. So that it's raised the question of form, and in raising the question of form and in making possible a certain notion of what aesthetic form is, renewing a certain notion of aesthetic form, I think it's also played a kind of crucial political role. and this goes back to one of the previous panels, the sort of accounts, the brilliant accounts of how Benjamin, but especially Brecht, hated photography. In a certain sense, hated photography for political reasons. I think it's kind of crucial here. And I think we also saw it, really, in our responses to those photographs, those deeply affecting photographs that were up earlier. The question of form, it seems to me, in our period, which is a period that begins, let's say, about 1978 or 79, and runs through to this moment, and is customarily called by political theorists the period of neoliberalism. It's also, not completely accidentally, the period of the rise and fall of postmodernism. Would that it were the rise and fall of neoliberalism. It's just been the rise so far, no falling. It's been a period of sustained political change, certainly throughout the so-called developed nations, but increasingly throughout the world, and that's part of what neoliberalism is all about. And what's crucial about form, what makes form political, is precisely that form resists one of the things that Brecht worried about. That is, form both refers to in the photograph, but breaks from the subject of the photograph. And perhaps we could talk about that in some of Jim's photographs. Form, and this is the sort of more controversial claim, is completely autonomous with respect to the beholder. That is to say, from the standpoint of the work of art, or a certain work of art, what you're feeling, the way we all had very powerful feelings, one way or the other, when we saw those photographs of the events in Somalia. But what you're feeling from the standpoint of the form of the work of art is completely irrelevant. It has nothing whatsoever to do with its meaning. And I think that, at this moment, is an important political claim. Why? And this is sort of the last thing I'll say, although I should keep on going at least till the light turns to yellow, because I sort of want to see that happen, is, I've never seen one of those before, kind of great, is that the politics of neoliberalism, the politics that have made possible this extraordinary rise in inequality, that's 2005. It gets way, way worse in 2007, 2008. And amazingly, it actually even gets worse during the current recession. And if you just did the top 0.1% of the top 1%, it would be even worse still. What makes this has been possible is that, in a certain sense, the politics of neoliberalism have been deeply a politics of identity and of affect. That is, of who people are and how we feel about them. And that have involved a systematic refusal, both on the part of right-wing neoliberals, that is, people who know they are conservative, and of left-wing neoliberals, people more like us who I think are conservative but don't quite know it, a complete and deep refusal of the category of class. Crucial thing here about the category of class is that people, your class position is not an identity. You do not belong to a class because people think you belong to a class. If you are poor, your poverty is not alleviated by people being nicer to you or ceasing to condescend to you or ceasing to be prejudiced in relation to you. One of the fundamental developments of the last 30 years has been this sort of transformation into poverty as a kind of identity, as if then the fundamental political project of the left should be to respect the poor. Whereas, of course, from a certain Marxist perspective, or indeed any redistributive perspective, the fundamental thing to do with poverty is not to respect the poor, but to eliminate the poor, that is to say, to redistribute the wealth. And what I would want to suggest to you today is that in the most ambitious photography of the last 30 years, even among photographers who have themselves no particular political interest, and I am looking at Jim Welling, who does have political views, but as far as I know, does not spend a lot of time reading Hegel and Marx. Okay, even among photographers like that, the ambition to form has come to play a useful role in the way we think about our contemporary politics, a role above all in beginning to help us see through the sort of crises of historicism, the crises of identity, the crises of representation, all of which have formed the sort of culture of neoliberalism, and begin to see a set of events, even including those awful events in Somalia and in Afghanistan and wherever, and indeed in the US and in the death chambers, as functions not of our ethical relations to people with different identities, but of our deeply political and economic relations, not only to people of different classes, but indeed of our own class, and indeed to the very idea of class. Thank you. Oh, I just made yellow. I feel I accomplished my goal. So you go.
Well, that's great, Walter. Very succinct. 7 minutes.
I didn't know you were timed.
So maybe I'd be curious for you to just go over some of your earlier ideas, starting with the gold standard, your kind of groundbreaking essay where you link up. What I found amazing was linking the idea of an economy, monetary theory, paper money versus silver and gold, to aesthetic theory. I mean, this seems like something that, you're a pioneer in terms of being able to put economics together with aesthetics.
Yeah,
How did you get that idea?
This is not really the Charlie Rose show, is it? We're doing this turn around. I don't know. Where did you get the idea for the whatchamacallit thing? Jim's work first interested me. He made me promise not to tell the Cindy Sherman story, so I'm not going to tell it. It involves buying things. It involves buying some things and not buying others a long time ago. My graph is gone. I thought my graph would stay the entire time. Well, I can't use it as a prop.
Put the graph up.
Doing this. I've always been interested in my work originally in the question of economics and the question of form. I got a much better account, although I didn't exactly give it just now so well, but I got a better account of why I'm interested in them. And Jim's work early on was useful for me. I don't know if you know, he did a series of aluminum foil photographs. They're sort of hard to see what they are, but they're not impossible to see what they are. And is there one on there someplace?
No.
No. And part of what interested me about it was that a lot of Jim's early work, it's been transformed in ways.
It's the last slide.
Yeah, it just shows that the rich are getting richer. I've actually kind of moved on myself as we're doing this. What is that what you saw in these photographs? Let's let it go. Because you're driving them insane, or me insane, and it doesn't really matter that much.
There it is.
Oh, perfect. Is that, there's always been a debate among people who write about photography and among photographers themselves, that the debate gets muted sometimes, about whether a photograph is or is not a representation. And there's an important sense in which at least a so-called straight photograph is not a representation. That is, it has a causal connection to the thing it's a photograph of that is different from, let's say, a painting of it or from a word used to name it. There are many different ways of talking about this. The discourse of indexicality is one of them. It doesn't matter for our present purposes which one it is. The thing that interested me about Jim's photographs very early on, and we're thinking now sort of work that was done in the early 1980s, was that on the one hand, these photographs had a very strong relation to the things they were photographs of. It was not, you were immediately drawn into that. You knew you were looking at something in the world, and that was a crucial point. But at the same time, you felt very strongly the effort to produce a kind of internal unity within the photograph itself, what I'm calling here, what I call today form. So there was a kind of tension in the photographs between the things they were photographs of and the attempt to assert a kind of problematic relation to their being so connected to the world. One way to put this would be just to say that the photographs dramatize what we would call their external relations. They're connected up to the world, connected up to the observer, but they also dramatize their internal relations. Alain Badiou has said kind of very brilliantly that the only finite thing in the world is art. Work of art is the only finite thing in the world. And I didn't have that phrase then, but looking at Jim's early work actually seemed to me to dramatize just that. Why did that connect up with money? It connected up with money right away, because if you were a historian of the 1880s and 1890s writing about the literature of the period, and you recognized that the battle over the gold standard was a kind of crucial issue, and then you looked at the battle over the gold standard in these terms, what you saw right away was the battle over the gold standard, that is the battle over whether gold should be money or whether there should be paper money, I'm simplifying a bit for these purposes, was precisely a battle about the nature of representation. What did the gold bugs want? The gold bugs wanted only gold to count as money, which is to say they didn't really want there to be money. because gold traded at its price, not as money, but at its price as gold. So if they thought all money had to be backed by gold, they thought what? They thought that basically there should be no such thing as money, or money should just be a sign of gold. Whereas the free silver people, but then the greenback people, thought that no, money was a representation. So you realize right away there was a certain problem in political economy about the nature of representation in relation to the object. And this was a problem that was central to photography. Interestingly enough, it wasn't that central to the photography of the period, but it was actually really central. I thought just to Jim's work. But then actually, if you look at the whole generation that emerged, you begin to see a kind of, I won't call it obsession because it's no doubt unconscious with many, but you begin to see a kind of commitment to that set of problems. The more formal term would be to say the ontology of the work of art. And Jim's work has always been for me about the ontology of the work of art. And as it turns out, when you are talking about what a work of art is, you are, whether you want to or not, involving yourself in a whole set of discourses about, and in our moment, the neoliberal moment, the moment in which everything is monetized, in which everything is for sale, the commitment to the relation between the real and the representation is actually a kind of political commitment. So for me, the two things were connected up.
Say that again.
If I say it again, people will say that can't possibly be true. The whole thing for me is I say it fast and you move on.
But
There's an essay, there's a journal that Jim and I are both editors of, just went up live about 2 weeks ago called nonsite.org. Nonsite, like Smithson non-sites. There's a very long essay of mine called Neoliberal Aesthetics on the freed Rancière and the form of the photograph. That actually will explain the whole thing to everybody's satisfaction.
But we have you here.
Yeah.
Your use of the word form, it almost should be in italics because it means so many. It's like such a big term. It's almost like a Greek word.
Yeah. Well, you took away the Eggleston.
Sorry?
You took away your Eggleston.
Yeah, I had an Eggleston
quote. Tell them what you had the Eggleston quote say.
Okay. When you teach photography, you read Sharkowski. And Sharkowski's essay on Eggleston, I think, is one of the most maddening, amazing essays. He starts out in the beginning where he wonders if, why Eggleston's photographs around Memphis are so amazing. And Sharkowski says, wouldn't it be great if the places where Eggleston photographed were the work? And then Sharkowski says, but we know better. The artist, the place is never the work. It's what the artist, does with it. I mean, very, very crudely. But that struck in I haven't been able to get that out of my head. What if the place were the work? So, in other words, what if the represented were the work?
Yeah, I mean,
But the other quote that anyway, go on.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, no.
Well, because the point about this was that then when we were talking a bit about this in advance, but it really is a kind of rehearsal of conversations we've had, or indirectly, sometimes in print a million times. I mean, part of the point would be there. Jim's completely fascinated by place in general, even if he didn't read the Eggleston stuff. If you just hang out with him, you have to go visit places that he's from, and you have to go see these things and revisit them. And of course, photography does have a kind of part of the photography indexicality thing is there's a very powerful relation to the place. If I take out my little iPhone now and take a picture here, it's directly related to this place and you people, and me being here at this time, in a way that a poem about this place might not be, in a way that a painting obviously needn't be. I can make a painting of a place that's never existed, just rehearsing the obvious thing. So there's a certain sense then in which part of the point about this is that the photographers who have been most interesting, at least to me, are photographers precisely who've experienced what Jim experiences in this very intense form, the desire for the represented to be the work, the desire for the place to be the work. But when we were talking about Eggleston, a photographer whom I've always had kind of not fully seen. I've never loved Eggleston. But Jim said something very, I thought, useful for me, which was contrasting that relation to place with the complete intensity of this artificial color, a color which doesn't belong to any place in the world. Right? It has no relation to the world. It doesn't matter where you go, you won't see those colors. It's part of what is going on in Jim's glass house photographs. And it's the tension then, right, between this commitment to place and the feel that the work should be the place. And then this intervention, which doesn't ever make the place irrelevant, but reduces the place to a kind of having a causal role in the production of this work, but in a certain sense, only a causal role. That's, for me, the moment of form. It's deeply associated not with sort of physical characteristics, but with the intentionality of the artist. That's a topic that hasn't come up today and would be a wide one, but it's no accident that at the moment, back there at the beginning of this little graph, which gets to be a prop after all, if you were doing literary theory, you would say that's the moment 2 or 3 years before that when anti-intentionalism, the idea of the work of art, does not mean what the author or the photographer or the artist intended it to mean, becomes absolutely dogmatic in literary theory and has remained so to this day. And I actually think that's a fundamental mistake. It's kind of a theoretical mistake, and I can email me and I'll give you the references to read. Well, don't all email me, but no danger of that, I'm sure. But where that kind of discourse of anti-intentionality becomes crucial, and where what you see in Jim's work at this moment is precisely the assertion of the intentionality of the artist. And that assertion, again, does not depend upon the response of the beholder. I mean, it depends upon the response of the beholder. The beholder is supposed to figure out what it is he's doing. But the question of how the beholder feels about it is, as it were, a personal question. And indeed, one of the problems with our political responses to events like the things we've seen before is precisely that. They are personal. We have these strong feelings. But our feelings have nothing whatsoever to do with the political situation. And when Susie Linfield said before, I thought she was totally right. She said, it's one thing to respond to this stuff. It's nothing to figure out what to do. And the reason Brecht hated those photographs was because he thought because people tended to think there should be some direct response, connection between our response and what you should do. Whereas the analysis is not an analysis of how we feel. It's an analysis of actually what's going on in the world. And the sense of what we should do is not, again, a sense of what we think is sort of the ethical thing to do. It's a question of what you would do in relation to a particular political ideology. One of the advantages of Marxism is that it enables you to sort of see your way through to ideology and see what it means to act not on the basis of your response, but on the basis of what you believe to be true. I mean, that's a long way from Eggleston and the Glass House. But part of what I'm interested in is that I think it's completely seamless in a certain way. So if you were doing like a history of the political economy, if you were doing what I tried to do for the 1880s and 1890s, a kind of political economy of art and political economy in the 1880s and 1890s, if you're doing that for today, it would make complete sense to put that graph, those pictures that we saw this morning, the horrible ones, and Jim Welling's Glass House up together, to say they're part of the same moment, part of the good things in that moment, the possible alternatives to it, but part also of the destructive parts of it. So moving on.
But, it seems like we're leaving the whole question of art in the dust, because in a way you're, arguing, you're talking about photography, and, in Michael Fried's book about how photography counts as art, and when we began to, when I looked at the yet another photography as art kind of title for this talk, it seemed like, and again, someone today was mentioning to me that about museums don't need photography programs, photography departments, because it's kind of irrelevant. In a way, it seems like photography is such a distinct field that it's almost as distinct from the other visual arts as, say, architecture is from the other visual arts. I mean, I think you're making an argument for this incredible, the power of photography as both a political utterance and also as something that almost stands outside of aesthetics.
I don't mean to say that. I think that photography is, I think it's important because it has been central to the history of art. But, it needn't be 10 years from now.
I disagree. I mean, I think putting photography and art together is a mistake. I think economically it makes sense to make big photographs to compete with paintings, but this is where narrative photography, I think, is, to quote Charlotte, laughable.
Yeah. Well, the thing about it is that it's
I
hard.
mean, or big photographs are.
Big photographs, yeah. It's hard to take seriously. You're sort of disagreeing because, like, what do? You're an artist who makes photographs. So, I think there's a way in which, it's like the advantage of having a critic, I mean, I explain to you what they mean. You can have your views, but you should really keep them to yourself, So look at this. It's like, this is what I get paid to do. What you get paid to do is that part. For me, the issue is really that why photography has been crucially of interest now. It needn't always be. I mean, look, you could, in an earlier version, I tried to write something, but it was just too hard because it was too short. But, one thing I would say is that there are so many more important photographs and photographers in the last 30 years than there are any other form of artist. That's non-controversial with respect to painting, probably. Non-controversial with respect to sculpture. More controversial with respect to performance art. You'd have to have the argument. But I think it's still nonetheless true. It wasn't always true. It's not like that, Jim and Jeff Wall and Thomas Dayman, all of whom I admire a great deal, were like more talented than Walker Evans. Jeff Wall has said quite rightly, no one's ever been more talented than Walker Evans. Or Paul Strand, whom we both started out in different ways loving. It's rather that photography as art has mattered more, been more central to the history of art in the last 30 years than it was, even though there were many great photographs made in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. That won't always be the case. The future of photography, it's going to always be there. There'll be people doing these various things. Your generation and the generations just after you, I hope it extends down to Arthur, because we're looking out for his reputation too. You hit the number. You're doing photography at the moment when it really matters. But I would be totally surprised if 50 years from now it mattered in the same way. And if 50 years from now, if someone was talking about the great photographers, they'd be talking about the great photographers of the late 20th and early 21st century and talking about their involvement in the things we've been describing today. So I don't, from my standpoint, the photographic universe is a universe which is, of course, technologically interesting to everybody. But as a moment in the history of art, it's on the one hand a very small moment, but on the other hand, the most important thing about it. I mean, if you're an art historian, it's the thing that's been the most important thing to do. So there's a certain sense in which it'd be useful to say, well, I don't think we should link photography and art. But on the other hand, if you couldn't link photography and art at this moment, no one would care about either one. We should have discussion.
Yes.
I mean, I'm making the light bulbs change because
If there are questions, please let the mics come to you.
A question in the back.
Oh, well, while he's getting the microphone there, I'll just say we're looking for things for non-site, both photographers and writers. So
it would appear like anything else. It's the content. Photography is only good as its content. My question is this: if you can't link photography to art, I'm fascinated by the pictures of Georgia O'Keeffe's sun-worn skin. Most people don't know who Morris Graves is or that he was black. Jasper Johns young, Jasper Johns old. Katharine Hepburn painted. I photographed her paint set, which looks like a painting, actually. I did it in tungsten film. Again, I ask you, isn't photography just as good as its content? A lot of people are taking photography as art. There's no content. In my opinion, it's garbage. If the content is good, don't you think it can be linked to art and certainly to document the artist, him or herself?
Garbage, yeah. Well, that's a little strong, but I don't think that the content. I think content is crucially important to understanding any photograph. I don't think the question of its content, and what you said, the last thing you said, as a documentation of art, I absolutely, of course, agree with that. But I don't think content, that is what the photograph is a photograph of, has anything then to do with its value as art. if you look at Jim's early photographs, again, I started to use you as the example, but I know the work well and you're here. If you look at the draped photographs, the aluminum foil photographs, then you look at the world. I remember the first time going to his studio. It was kind of like romantic to go to any artist studio. His was very neat but very small. He was a poor artist at the time. And looking at the piece of cloth that had been used to make these beautiful and increasingly large and kind of monumentally beautiful draped photographs. It's a piece of cloth. You know, it's not like a sunset. Photograph of a sunset is maybe beautiful if the sunset's beautiful. It's not a photograph of a beautiful piece of cloth. That's precisely the moment in which photography, what isn't beautiful?
Murders aren't necessarily beautiful.
No, but photographs of murders aren't necessarily art either. Right, but photographs, you know,
Why does the content have to be beautiful?
it doesn't. It doesn't at all, but that's the point of the sort of difference from it. You know, Poe said, you know what Poe thought was the most beautiful thing for poetry? All poems should be about. He thought all poems should be about the same thing. The death of a beautiful woman, he thought, is the most poetic thing there is. The book I'm writing right now is a book called Neoliberal Aesthetics, The Death of a Beautiful Woman. But the importance of the death of a beautiful woman, if you think of it disconnect it now from actual dying, and which Poe certainly did, it's actually just the way in which a representation of something can produce something beautiful out of something whether or not it's beautiful. That is, the way in which the representation marks a kind of, like Cal sort of famously said at one point, the symbol is the murder of the thing. When you begin to think in those terms, that's when you get sort of interest of art, and that's also for me where you get the contemporary politics of art. Yeah, no. Right. Well, I don't deny that.
We'll take another question.
Actually, would like to see if I could expand on the idea of the subject versus the picture. Because my feeling has always been that I basically could not care less about the subject. And if it is a strong subject, like the murder pictures, then to me, it is more of a documentation than a work of art. My feeling has always been that, a great painter could paint the grill on that speaker, and it would be incredibly moving, even if it is just the grill and the speaker. And I think I heard some self-contradiction in what you were saying about form and what you're saying now about, the subject versus the actual picture. And I guess that's my question is...
Am I contradicting myself?
Yes.
Yeah, no.
Okay, thanks.
The only thing I'd say is I do think the subject matter is super important. I mean, I don't think we would obviously have a kind of serious ethical problem if we thought that the photographer photographing that stoning was sort of like worried about like composition, at the moment, right? I mean, that would be the point where you'd say, no, it's completely inappropriate to make a work of art out of that photograph. But there's an important sense, though, in which I think it does matter what the subject of a photograph is. It isn't determinative, it isn't dispositive. So it does matter that you're going to make photographs out of aluminum foil. It matters differently that you're going to make photographs out of glass houses. And the relation to subject matter is importantly different there, but it's never the thing that determines it. And for me, again, I don't mean politics in general. I mean the politics of the last 30 years, neoliberal politics. The way that we've begun to think of a politics which is not simply or primarily a politics of identity, a politics of how we feel about each other, a politics of anti-sexism, anti-racism, anti-homophobia, all of which are good things, but which is a politics of class, which, as I said before, has nothing to do with how we think about each other, that's become emblemized in the idea of form and the possibility of form. That's why I wrote a piece on Jeff Wall called The Politics of a Good Picture, and it's about a political picture that Wall makes. But I could equally well have written a version of that piece with a different analysis of the photograph about one of Jim's pictures, which aren't at all political, because what I'm suggesting is that the emergence of a kind of claim for photographic form is an important kind of counterbalance to a politics which is nothing but a politics of identity.
Walter, why do you think this moment arises in the late 70s? It's like Foucault's episteme. It's like there's this change that takes place in the 70s. What do you think? What's your sense of how form changes?
Well, I mean, I think part of it is just you have a lot of people who want to get rid of form. I mean, if you read Roz Krauss from the 70s and early 80s, and then read Rancière from like yesterday, they're actually making exactly the same argument about getting rid of form, which I think is kind of politically progressive. I think they were wrong about that. And they're both interested in the photograph as a way of doing it. For Roz Krauss, it was originally O'Sullivan. Some of the photographs we saw earlier today.
In 78, she's trying to get rid of form.
Absolutely. And Rancière in like 2010 is attacking Fried for doing this.
Why do you think Krauss was interested in that issue?
Because I actually think the sort of question of what a work of art was, which had been so crucial to painting, say through color field, began to look unimaginable in painting. And that the problem of what form was began to be identified with the photograph. Yeah, it becomes
sculpture.
That's right. It becomes a question of sculpture. It's not a historical question. But the crucial thing is also it begins to matter because Margaret Thatcher is elected and because Ronald Reagan is elected. That's like, the 1980 part of this. And because there are political changes which actually go both with that critique of form that Roz Krauss is making and with the assertion of form that then begins to emerge in what were then a very bunch of young photographers. So why do those two things go together? I don't know. That would be a hard one. But the whole point of the episteme for Foucault was that you have to explain it.
Up in front.
This is a fascinating conversation. And Jim, I wondered if you could... Oh, thanks. Jim, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about this issue of form and photographic content with respect to what it means for the medium to change so dramatically, especially for you with the adoption of Photoshop, and what does it mean to make, so quote-unquote textureless photographs with something like Maya. So I'd love to hear more about the intersection of medium, form, content.
Well, I swing both ways. I think sometimes it doesn't really affect me at all. It's to use that debased word, it's another tool. My concerns have been, working through. I mean, I came out of a visual art background. I studied, painting and sculpture and video art. So that those inform how I think about photography. That is, having a couple of different mediums. So, Maya seems like almost a sculpture medium. It's like working with sculpture, working with three-dimensional form. It's so on the one hand, Photoshop. I mean, I guess it would be radical to say it doesn't really change much at all. It gives me a kind of, it allows me to do new things. I can work in color. I could never work in color before because I couldn't manipulate it sufficiently. So there's a way of technologies allowing me to do, what I want to do, the things that I'm interested in. But on the other hand, you become, as an artist, you become energized by a different kind of material. I think it's different for writers. I don't think writers, maybe, you're now more excited about the internet and changing, you're rewriting. But in a way, the typewriter didn't change writing as much as the forms that visual artists use. And of course, you can look at it in welding, sculpture, all kinds of other media. So I'd have to say, at this point, I don't really think about it as changing that much. It's just fascinating to work in Maya is fascinating for that textureless world, because it shows me that one of the things that photography is primarily interested in or represents is the texture of things, the texture of the world. And so it's great to be able to do something that doesn't have that.
May I continue? I was reading your interview in Art in America the other day, where you said that you were talking about origins and that everything that is being represented has some kind of an origin, similarly to the way that there's a photographer behind every photo that is taken. So I'd like to juxtapose what you just said about the Maya and the textureless forms that I'm not sure really have origins with this concept of a beginning or a source.
The quote was that when I look at a photograph, and I think, I'm not unique, I'm sure most people who work in photography, you can get a sense of the materials that were being used. I think when I read, critics who describe photography, I'll give an example. Kathy Opie, her show was reviewed at Orange County Museum a few years ago. It was a survey show, and Chris Knight talked mostly about the content of the pictures, but I could see all of these different relationships she had to the camera, to the materials she was using, to her color sense, the kinds of things that most people are sensitive in painting. It's just that, most people aren't familiar with the way photographs are made. As I'm sure most of the people in this room can look at a picture and see what kind of camera was used, where that person's standing. So this idea of where the photographer stands, whether they're running when they take the picture, whether they're on a tripod, those sorts of issues are more visible to me as a photographer, and they're things that I like to look at. I remember talking to Luc Delhay about what kind of camera he used, because I always like to ask people what sort of camera they use, and he photographs in a lot of very intense parts of the world, and I said, what kind of, he uses a 4x5, I said, what kind of 4x5 do you use? He said, one that I can run with. So that was the idea of a sensitive viewer looking at a picture can pull more out of it than someone who's perhaps not as familiar with the technologies of photography.
We have time for one more question.
One of the things that hasn't been mentioned that I have felt for the beginning of when I started making pictures myself is the frustration with the flat piece of paper and what to do with that. And I don't know what everybody else thinks, but to me that's the biggest obstacle of all, is that it is so limiting, and so inevitably we try to use other tools in order to sort of combat that very limitless sort of object that we're working with.
I think that's really a good statement, though. It sort of brings back sort of subtext of all this, which would be the sort of medium of specificity question. One of the things that defines a medium in a certain moment is precisely the frustrations that it produces, and then a sort of sense of what it is one wants to do in relation to that. And I was pleased to meet you before because I've admired your work for a long time. I'm glad to meet you sort of in public again now. One of the things that's really interesting about your work is that you can see that frustration at work. That is, you don't always see it overcome, but you can see the effort to overcome it. So you can see, and that would be part of what I meant earlier by form. That is the sort of sense of what it is to produce not, just a record of something, but a work, and a work which has various kinds of changing but real limitations. And to me, that would be kind of, central. So that if you were looking again at the history of art in the last 30 years, if you're looking at the history of photography, you're looking at the history of series of different kinds of attempts to deal both with opportunities and limitations. And that's what the history of form would look like. And that history of form would also be, if done right, a kind of history of the politics, not only of the photographer, and not even primarily the photographer, but of the moment itself.
So it would not be incorrect, but perhaps incomplete, to say that another way of talking about form is to talk about materials.
Yes, talk about materials, but not just about materialism. So that's totally right. Materials would matter, but not as a materialism. With that gnomic remark, maybe we should stop.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jim and Walter.